All right, well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you that are joining us from Europe and the UK. I am Melissa Marchand, your Caribbean Strategy Advisor for Global News Matters, and it is my honor and my pleasure to welcome you to our webcast today. We have a top-notch panel of speakers lined up for you to get your questions answered on the implications of Brexit for the Caribbean. We want to make sure that you get exactly what you came for today, so I'm going to go ahead and explain some of the logistics of the question and answer portion while we still have a few people connecting. Please use the panel at the right side of your screen to submit your questions, and you can do this throughout the broadcast today.
Right.
And we'll be addressing those at the end of the call. So that's going to be the final 20 to 30 minutes that we'll be addressing those. And I also like to invite you to download these speaker bios, and you can do that at bit.ly/Brexit bios. And that is going to allow us to dive right into the content today with each speaker. So thank you once again for joining us this morning, and I am now going to turn it over to our facilitator, Anton Edmonds. Anton, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Just give me 1 second. And you're Anton, you need to unmute yourself. I can't hear you.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction to the panel. I'm going to sort of forego a lot of the usual stuff that one does as it relates to chairing this kind of session, and I'm going to just give a brief introduction in terms of the speakers that we have with us and delve right into the questions. We have David Jessup, who is a consultant with the Caribbean Council, based out of the UK, former managing director of that entity, who has worked on regional issues for over 40 years. We have Ambassador Richard Bernal with us, who's the Pro Vice Chancellor of Global Affairs, University of the West Indies, former ambassador to the US, an executive at the Inter-American Development Bank, but probably more relevantly, he was the lead negotiator for the Caribbean on a variety of trade agreements, including that with the EU. We have Marla Dukaran, who's a group economist, Caribbean Banking, Royal Bank of Canada, who advises corporate governance, risk management, and strategic planning committees on the impact of global and regional developments. We have Dr. David Lewis, Vice President of Manchester Trade, based in Washington, D.C., who brings 25 years of business and trade advisory expertise to the equation, serving governments and the private sector on trade liberalization, competition, and investment policy. And we do have Dr. Indrajit Rupra, who is the Regional Economic Advisor for the Caribbean, the Inter-American Development Bank, which is the largest development bank partner to the region and its member states. I want to turn immediately to David and ask David, well, based on where you sit in the UK, to sort of lead the discussion, start us up, and in a sense, maybe you want to give us a snapshot of where we are and in broad strokes, whether the region needs to focus on one relationship versus the other. I think that's one of the things that we're struggling with. So let me turn over to you, David. Is this a divorce for everybody? Or does the region focus on EU versus the UK? Give us an update.
I'm sorry, David, you'll need to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Anton, thanks very much for the introduction. Some of you may have heard Britain's new Prime Minister yesterday saying out means out as far as Brexit is concerned. But what sort of out and when is still far from clear. And whether it's separation, divorce, or reconciliation with Europe is also far from clear. Let me start by just giving a little bit of background as to where the United Kingdom is. Mrs. May made very clear yesterday that the UK is unlikely to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, giving notification of the UK's intentions to leave the European Union until the end of this year. And it seems pretty clear that the period between now and the end of the year will be a period of reflection on future options for a new relationship with the EU27, and very importantly also with the wider world. So the process will not only involve the UK deciding on the type of future ties it might want with the European Union, but also with other significant trade partners such as India, China, the United States, Singapore, and the Caribbean as well in due course. And then the United Kingdom embarks on what is an extremely uncertain 2-year process of negotiated departure, possibly followed or possibly in parallel to the negotiation of a new relationship with the EU and with the other countries. Alarmingly, some of the lawyers and others I've spoken to have suggested the process could take up to 10 years in total, as of course it also involves unraveling, replacing EU regulations and laws, possible legal challenges, an unclear role for the British Parliament, the United Kingdom determining a new foreign policy, and that's to say nothing of the additional complications that will arise if Scotland seeks independence remain in the European Union. Complicate matters further, both could play to domestic, political and economic tensions within the EU 27. Europe is already fragile. It could generate new EU divisions, making unanimity on any new deal with the United Kingdom difficult to deliver, and at worst could shake the foundation of the European Union. I should explain a little bit about the process as well, which is last hearing. The process is to be managed by a new Brexit ministry, and that in itself will be challenging, because whoever the minister in charge is will have to reconcile political views that on the one hand seek to limit migration into the EU with a desire to negotiate what is in fact one of a small number of possibilities for a new trade relationship. And my suspicion is that as this process moves forward, politicians, including the Prime Minister, are going to have to face some very, very difficult challenges as they spell out to the country what is practical, that's a taste of what might have been wished for. But also a whole range of other legal issues I won't go into, but one I would point to is that it has to be resolved, which relates to the official relationship with Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Having said that, I think it's also very important for anyone in the Caribbean to understand that there's nothing structural in the Caribbean's relationship with either the EU27 is going to have some problems. The Caribbean's relationship with the EU27 as well as programme development support will continue unchanged well into. In that sense, it provides a breathing space in which the Caribbean can study the strategic longer term how the changes might affect its goods and services markets in the EU27 and determine how best to respond. It might also be a good moment perhaps for the Caribbean to think about whether it should be reordering its international relations. Having said that, I think addressing Brexit for the Caribbean is going to be challenging for the obvious reasons that the Caribbean is not a trade or political priority for the United Kingdom. Despite that, it's clear that the decision to leave will touch Caribbean trade, tourism, financial services, foreign exchange earnings, investment flows, development assistance. It will also result in the region losing the voice of a good friend in the councils of Europe, just at a moment when the EU is looking at its long-term foreign policy, its trade policies are being reconsidered, it's thinking about the nature of a future ACP relationship, and it's also considering how to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's also worth mentioning as well is that the United Kingdom at present provides about 15% of European development funds. And again, another lack of clarity is what is going to happen. Is the EU in the longer term going to make up the shortfall? And how is the United Kingdom going to prioritize its future bilateral development assistance? And in that context, will the Caribbean have any priority at all, given that it's regarded as much better off than most other regions that the United Kingdom assists? And something else, which is a completely separate subject, which I won't go into in any detail, is that there are pressing and unique uncertainties as far as the British overseas territories in the Caribbean are concerned. And I think, and this is the point, the question that Anton raised, I think it raises the issue about how the Caribbean itself intends eventually to re-engage with the United Kingdom that's removed itself from the European Union. And it seems to me that there are three generic trade options, and perhaps we'll hear some more from the other speakers about some of these generic trade options that the United Kingdom might pursue in terms of a new European relationship. The first is perhaps akin to Norway or Switzerland. It will be a European Free Trade Area plus or minus type agreement. Second is an association agreement, and although it's not likely to parallel it, a good way of thinking about this is the association agreement the European Union signed recently with Central Americans, or it could be a WTO type arrangement. But I think the key point in all of this is whatever happens, the Caribbean is going to have to negotiate with the United Kingdom. Otherwise, it will lose its free trade agreement arrangements under the economic partnership agreement in the context of the UK. And in sort of drawing my little presentation to a close, I think another issue that it will probably be very important for the Caribbean to consider, and I've not seen any discussion of this at all, is whether the region will approach any negotiation with the United Kingdom as CARICOM, as CARIFORUM, or possibly as CARIFORUM plus Cuba and maybe even the OTs, given that Cuba is on the verge of signing a new arrangement with the European. But one has to say that this raises all sorts of other questions, because CARIFORUM was only able to meet its EPA terms because of the inclusion of the Dominican Republic. Just in drawing my presentation to a close, what it seems to me is that the region perhaps needs to do is to develop a detailed analysis of the extent to which the United Kingdom outside of the European Union will continue to matter, and then develop relations very rapidly with the new political teams in London, with the key people in the Brexit ministry, while at the same time cultivating high-level political contacts in other EU states, given the region is going to want some strong and powerful friends in Brussels. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for the intervention. That's interesting elements that you laid out, especially as it relates to the region engaging with the EU and the UK, which sort of transitions us perfectly to our next speaker in Richard Bernal. And is Richard on?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Because basically we're transitioning to you, and really the question as to the regional response. I mean, considering your role in leading trade negotiations with the EU, the hard question for you is the following: how ready and nimble is the region as it relates to managing and tracking the impact on trade and this evolving situation?
Thank you. Are you hearing me?
We're hearing you just fine, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think that the region expected, like many people, that the vote would have been close, but that the UK would have stayed with the EU. So the region was caught, taken by surprise. The reaction naturally has been one of concern and uncertainty. Uncertainty because this is an almost unprecedented situation, and it involves a major trade and diplomatic partner. Uncertainty also because of the political situation, which is evolving rapidly, change of leadership in the Conservative Party, and uncertainty in the Labour Party. It looks as if the process will start earlier, which means that the Caribbean, in particular CARICOM, has to move quickly to begin to shape a response. I would suggest that the CARICOM governments establish quickly a group of experts to monitor on a continuous basis the evolution of the process and to make periodic reports while trying to fashion a strategy which responds to two broad areas of concern. One is the possible economic disruption, which comes from the effects of withdrawal from the EU on the British economy, which could affect development assistance, trade, private foreign investment, tourism arrivals, etc. On the diplomatic front, the British have been a traditional and strong ally for us within the European Union councils, and it now means, with the absence of that, that the Caribbean needs to do a lot more in developing relations with the member states of the EU, some of which have no traditional relationship with the Caribbean. So I think the Caribbean needs to get together its expertise and begin to fashion a response. Obviously, the response can only be sketched in broad outline at this time, but it has to be periodically updated as information becomes available, and it has to be recalibrated as changes take place. One of the facts that the region has to face is that the region is a small economic entity, and while it has long-standing diplomatic relations, it is not of great strategic importance, and therefore it's not likely to be a priority item for either the UK as it changes its global economic and diplomatic relations, nor for the European Union. So the emphasis is going to have to be on a CARICOM response which is proactive, strategic, and which is continuous, and it needs to start immediately.
Thank you, Richard, for that. I'm going to circle back to you actually with a part two to that question, but let's transition a little bit to Marla. When we talk about this has been sort of couched largely in broad trade and diplomatic terms. Ground us a little bit in terms of economic repercussions, in terms of maybe some of the analysis that you're working on, or what you are considering working on as it relates to the importance of the UK and the EU to the economies writ large.
Marla, please unmute your mic.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Anton. I think if you think about the channels that this can affect the Caribbean, David and Ambassador Bernal outlined nicely some of the implications and a lot of the uncertainty that we face. I think what's important to remember, though, is that the immediate impact, I think, will come from the impact that this Brexit referendum result has had on global growth. You would recall the IMF would have announced that global growth is expected to be about 3.1% this year. They announced that first in January, and then when they issued their World Economic Outlook in April, even though they had outlined that the US was growing slower than expected in the fourth quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year, they maintained that 3.1 growth projection for this year. Now, incidentally, global growth below 3% implies that the US, the global economy, my apologies, global economy is in a recession. So if they were projecting 3.1% growth this year, before Brexit had happened, it would suggest to me that global growth was on shaky ground. And this is, by the way, the lowest growth projection for the global economy since we had that big contraction in 2009. So if you then layer on top of that borderline recessionary growth rate for the global economy, layer on top of that what has happened with this Brexit referendum result and the shock that has sent to the global economy. My guess is that the global economy is already now growing below 3%, so which means already growing at a recessionary rate. Now, the impact that that will have on the Caribbean is via multiple channels. First of all, we saw that the US dollar had been strengthening and continues to strengthen. This means that all of the currencies in the Caribbean, most of which are pegged to the US dollar, will strengthen in equal measure against the major currencies. You do have some depreciation taking place in the TT dollar, the Jamaican dollar, and the Dominican peso, but the rest of the currencies will largely have appreciated against the majors in much the same way that the US dollar did. This year, the Caribbean was projected to see stronger tourism inflows, and so the tourism-based economies were expected to see stronger growth this year. However, with what has happened in the UK and the shock to their economy, my guess is that we will see weaker stopover arrivals from the UK. And that's, even though they are not the biggest source market for tourists in this region, the US is the biggest. However, the UK tourists spend 7 times on average of any other tourist in this region. So that's a lot of spending that will probably not materialize this year that we had anticipated. The other thing is that stronger US dollar as well as weaker global growth means lower oil and gas prices. And while that's a positive thing for some countries in the Caribbean for most countries in the Caribbean that are not energy producers, for Trinidad, Suriname, for example, that continues to spell weaker exports and weaker fiscal earnings for these countries. So overall, I think right now the immediate impact via the global economic implications are largely negative. However, in the longer term, as David would have suggested, because of the uncertainty and because the Caribbean is not that high on the UK's list of priorities, it could be that we can suffer some trade and development setbacks. However, from a Commonwealth perspective, I think the 53 countries in the Commonwealth represent an opportunity for the UK to get closer to the Commonwealth and have closer ties. And as part of, most of us in the Caribbean are members of the Commonwealth. And I think this is a possibility for us, especially given that we now have our second Caribbean Secretary General of the Commonwealth and our first woman leader of the Commonwealth. I think Baroness Scotland will be pushing for closer ties between the UK and the Commonwealth, and that's a potential opportunity for us in the Commonwealth in the longer term.
Thank you. Thanks, Marla, for that intervention. David Lewis, take us a little bit beyond CARICOM, because we focused on that a little bit. It was alluded to by both Richard and David Jessup, but take us beyond that, sort of that particular space and into the wider region and the impact of the referendum. And curiously, my curiosity is, I mean, does this further segment separate the region? Are there some that are better poised to sort of move or be more nimble? What are your thoughts?
David, please unmute your mic.
You have to unmute.
David, we need you to unmute your mic.
There we go.
There we go. Good.
Yeah, I was hitting my click. Sorry about that. Right. I think, thank you all and appreciate the invitation and an excellent and timely discussion, both for the region, but also for all the partners regionally and internationally with the region. As alluded by Ambassador Bernal and David, I think one key issue is that the trade agenda in the world after the EPA in 2008 did not remain static. So we now have many more trade agreements. The EU itself has hundreds with many partners, with broader scopes and coverage than before in various disciplines and areas as well as geographies. We now have bilateral agreements, continental agreements, services agreements. So in a way, the EPA itself is no longer a best practice in terms of that trade and investment relationship. And that's going to be a big issue as we go forth, not only with the UK, but also with the European Union. Not to mention the fact that the EPA is not fully implemented in all of the CARIFORUM partners yet. So there's already a deficiency on the CARIFORUM side. Institutionally, we no longer have CARIFORUM-wide negotiating institution, the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery, and there's no prospects of success in those lines immediately. We're now a failure of a free trade agreement negotiation between CARICOM and Canada. There have been some bilateral preferential agreements with Guatemala and Panama, but really nothing major. And the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean do have very aggressive and dynamic trade agreements with the EU, the Economic Association Agreements, which really are outperforming the EPA of the region. Within the CARIFORUM, what we've seen over the years is that the non-CARICOM partner of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, although it's a full member of CARICOM now, have really outperformed the CARICOM partners in terms of trade, investment flows, and also even development assistance, which I know Inder will deal with. And it also shows the fact that in that period, both the UK and the broader EU have had a greater amount of interest with the rest of the region than just with CARICOM. So the real question is, how can the region compete faced with all these new actors coming in? And let me just give you some numbers that we put together looking at where all this is going. All Latin America Caribbean exports to the EU in 2015 are about 15% of their global exports. So the EU is not a dominant trade partner, but it is substantial. Latin America Caribbean exports to the UK, however, are barely 4% of that total. When we look at EU exports to CARIFORUM, they total about $8.3 billion. The EU imports from CARIFORUM about $5 billion. The DR numbers alone for those figures are about 23% of the exports, or about 19% of the imports. And then there's a breakdown for all the other CARIFORUM countries. In the case of the UK, though, David's point of the special relationship with CARICOM really is borne out, because UK exports to CARIFORUM and the imports show that the Dominican Republic, although it grew a lot, is only about 5% of the total. But it's really the growing curve that is of interest, because that's where it's advanced. And the UK is now the DR's fourth trading partner in the EU after Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands, and growing fast. Comparatively speaking, Central America, if you looked at it with their association agreement, would make up almost about 8% of that trade if it were joined in with CARIFORUM. So those issues tell us that, you know, there's a lot of dynamism going on with other markets, and the challenge is going to be, how can CARICOM re-dynamize itself, as Richard mentioned, set up an observe strategy and implementation capability for that, not only with the UK, but now with 27 other non-UK partners in the EU, as well as the EU Commission. I've got some points on the relationship after, as some of them have mentioned. Will it be a group? Will it be individual? But I think I'll take that in the question and answer period, Anton, so we can focus more on that in terms of the mechanisms and the engagement process. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We're going to turn swiftly across to Inder in terms of this first round of engagements. And as the man within probably the largest development agency or development bank as it relates to the Caribbean, what are your views in terms of where we are today from a development bank perspective?
Do you mind terribly if I take a really long way of answering that question? I wanted to contextualize our discussion You know, when there's a big major policy discussion like the one we're discussing, both sides really exaggerate their positions. You know, exit meant disaster for England and Caribbean, and leaving, or the other side said, you know, bliss would be obtained. You would have enormous amount of money for the National Health Service and no more immigrants. You know, that was more or less. So we shouldn't fall into the same trap of exaggerating the impact of Brexit on the Caribbean. So let me just say what we know and what we don't know. The referendum to leave the UK, to leave the European Union. We know the political turmoil that it impacted, but the new Prime Minister said she is going to inform the European Council of the exit early next year. So we know referendum, that the formal notice of exit will be given to the European Council next year. Sterling has devalued, although, as Marla pointed out, it's not just the bilateral currency that we have to look into, but also the triangulation with our currencies that devalued due to Brexit. But beyond that, the only thing we are certain about is that we are uncertain. Right? The only historical experience we've had of a country or a part of a country leaving the European was Greenland. And they took 3 years to negotiate, and that was a very simple, short period of time that they were part of the European Union, and it took 3 years. So we don't even know when any kind of negotiation will be reached. We don't know the terms of that agreement. I mean, what has been bandied about is the Norway example, which would, if it's taken back to the referendum, is the same as what the United Kingdom had already, except no place at the table.
I think we have a little bit of a glitch.
Anton, do you want to go ahead and take it back while we get Inderjeet back online?
Sure. I think what we're going to do is, while we do that, I want to circle back to you, David, actually, maybe with the first question that I had for you, and something that you alluded to, but you didn't have a chance to get into, which is the overseas territories. You wrote a piece recently, I think, on that, and specifically, and they're in the region, so let's not ignore them, and let's figure out, and there have been efforts over the years for them to work much more closely with the broader Caribbean. What is your sense in terms of plans that they could have, they should have, things that may be in consideration as it relates to their relationship, obviously the British ones, the relationships with the UK versus the EU, and the wider non-independent territories in the space?
One of the things that's very interesting about the overseas territories is that they have been unusually proactive. All of the UK's overseas territories commissioned a study before the vote, and a second part is due to come out shortly. So unusually they have identified the difficulties they face, which are, on the one hand, their relationship with the European Union is technically through the United Kingdom, although it actually operates through the Overseas Countries and Territories Association. But secondly, they've developed a very strong relationship with the European Commission and with all of the other European overseas territories, the Dutch and the French, with the European Union. So they received development flows, development assistance directly, I'm talking about the UK overseas territories in the Caribbean, from Brussels. And only one, Montserrat, receives any money directly from the United Kingdom. There's also a legal complication because they have, as overseas territories of the United Kingdom, they technically have a first call on the United Kingdom's time and support, and they are part indirectly of overall sort of management of foreign policy, etc. One of the issues that needs to be resolved very quickly, but from conversations I've had with politicians and officials in London, nobody has really thought this through in any kind of detail. But one of the issues that's going to need to be resolved very quickly is where do they fit into a negotiation? Many international agreements, the overseas territories are automatically added on in terms of documentation to whatever the United Kingdom signs. But where they will fall in any new relationship or any new negotiation is really unclear. So, for instance, if there was a European Free Trade Area type of arrangement, would they be included? It's as the last speaker was making the point, is I mean we're in this sort of area of just guessing to some extent, but the only point I particularly would make, as far as the overseas territories are concerned, they are and they ought to be a priority in terms of a relationship, or the new relationship the United Kingdom has with the European Union.
Thanks, David. Is Richard still with us? Let me transition across to you, Marlo. Considering some of the comments that you made earlier, and I'm curious as to where's the upside. You talked about the Commonwealth opportunity. David just talked about the fact that the overseas territories sort of have first dibs based on their relationships. I mean, what do you see as the upside in broad strokes? Is it the EU based on trade flows, like some of what David has alluded to, because of maybe investment from that space, or is it the UK, or is it quite frankly both at the same time? And I think that's one of the questions out there when you look at past relationships, when you look at the evolution as to where we are economically. Do you have I mean, if you had to flip a coin, which one would you say that the region should double down on as it relates to engaging immediately and spending more time on immediately, considering that there's still some time for this to be fleshed out?
Are you guys hearing me now?
Yes.
You know, it's so difficult to, as everybody said, Inderjeet said it nicely, the only thing we're certain about is uncertainty, right? I actually hope and believe that the UK, you know, through its process of reconfiguring its relationship with the EU, which we know will take a lot of time, which we don't know how it will end up looking. I suspect it would look like a hybrid between what exists now and a complete divorce, if you will, or exit. It'll look somewhere along the spectrum of a hybrid between the two. I think the real opportunity for the Caribbean would rest with the UK and its Commonwealth relationship. That's what I think is the simplest and most obvious channel by which the Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean can benefit from this reconfiguration of the UK's relationship with the EU. Now, with respect to the Caribbean or CARIFORUM's relationship with the EU and via the EPA, I am not sure. Maybe David, one of the Davids, can tell us, but I'm guessing that relationship will not need to change, because the relationship that the CARIFORUM has with the EU via the EPA doesn't need to change. If the UK is no longer part of that, we would just have to renegotiate with the UK. So I'm guessing that relationship is not where things will change the most materially, meaning CARIFORUM with the EU. I think it's really us with the UK, and my guess is that the Commonwealth is the most obvious channel via which that can most quickly that relationship be reignited and renewed emphasis being placed on that relationship.
Thanks. Let's pivot back to Inda. Inda, you were basically telling us that it was much ado about nothing. But let's have you continue in terms of your thoughts and back to the development.
I'm not sure that I was saying much ado about. I'm not sure that I was saying much ado about nothing. I mean, what we do know is what the evaluation of the pound sterling could imply lower tourism from UK, depending on the price elasticity. But you have to, and it could apply a lower remittances from the UK. But depends how households adjust. I mean, the households may increase the amount of remittances in pound sterling, and therefore same in dollar terms. So even that we are not certain about. And certainly, as Mala said, the agreement, the master agreement with the European Union will remain in place, including with UK, until the divorce terms have been settled. And who knows, they may fall in love again. So that's my point. I think that, yes, it has a negative impact. Uncertainty always has a negative impact on economic growth and economics in particular, in general, economic variables. But we're talking about 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before any kind of negotiation could go ahead. I would like to point out something different, though. Since independence, the ties that bind colonies with the ex-colonialists have really weakened. Today, for the West Indies and the Caribbean, it's the US, it's the UK, it's the Far East that are increasingly becoming trade partners. And I think one of the Davids said this. So, for me, it looks like it's not to sit down and lament that further deterioration of that link with the United Kingdom, but take this as an opportunity. Trade and export promotion is really needed to enhance the economic growth of the Caribbean. But one of the factors that has hindered economic growth is that its trading partners are often trading partners that have lower economic growth, are not the dynamic markets in the world. So today, given the prospect of 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road, that England will no longer, the United Kingdom may no longer exist, it may be just England, and the Scottish are now part of the Europe, independent country. It's to look elsewhere. I mean, this is a crisis or a shock is always an opportunity going forward. And here the opportunity is for CARICOM or CARIFOR to start negotiating either as I think there's a lot of cynicism regarding the institutionality of these two organizations, or individually, looking at markets nearby. I mean, Latin America, Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking, is an immense market where transport costs will be less, doing business that will not necessarily be less, but could be on the way. So really, I think that instead of being prisoners of a colonial attitude, which is England is our savior, we should look for the Commonwealth. I mean, the Commonwealth is a political and cultural institution. It's no longer an economic powerhouse. Trade between Commonwealth members are no longer the most dynamic one. So my conclusion is this is an opportunity for the West Indies or the Caribbean to diversify its export and import markets, diversify its political and cultural connections to other parts of the world. And you're beginning to see that already last few years. I mean, after all, Trinidad now exports gas to Chile and Argentina. Last time I was talking to some of the chambers of commerce in Trinidad, they were telling me they were going to various countries where they're down to export markets. So really, I think that I'm not saying that there's no negative shock from Brexit. The magnitude of that shock and the end result, we are totally opportunity to start looking for new trade partners in Latin America or accentuated and towards the east. the two areas that are potentially much more dynamic going forward than, I hate to use these old phrases like old Europe or you know, so that's my bottom line really. It's not that it's not a negative shock. It's very relatively minor going forward. What the eventual cumulative shock will be depends on the divorce, which we have no idea when it will occur or what the terms will occur. But during this period, instead of us lamenting about Brexit or twiddling our thumbs, it should be really a strategy of looking for new markets and new partners. That's my bottom line. And if you go back to, you know, one of the things I was supposed to talk about, which was aid. I mean, the Caribbean, there's two trends in the last decade or so. One is that aid has moved towards poorer countries. The West Indies is not generally in that category. That's one. Secondly, it has moved from budget support or general support towards things like energy and climate change. There's an enormous number of funds that have been created, which unfortunately the Caribbean has not tapped into. So even regarding aid, the framework with which the Caribbean negotiated the trade agreement has an aid component, which will not be affected by Brexit until the divorce occurs. So maybe I'm being complacent, but I think one has to look at this a little bit more pragmatically and not put on the fire alarm. Was that too much of a meandering reply to your question?
No, it was just fine. I think you took us down a path that we needed to go down a little bit, and then circling back to the trade aid element, I think is spot on. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn to you, Richard. Yes.
Can I just make an interjection here?
Sure.
You know, I think yes, Inder is right. This is going to take some time. We don't know where it's going, but we do know some things already. This is not all the world of speculation. These are established facts. The data proves it. One, it is 10 years of the EPA, and the CARICOM partners of that CARIFORUM EPA are the worst performers in trade, investment, and use of development assistance. That's a fact. That is there. Within the CARIFORUM group, compared to the later association agreements that the EU has signed with Latin America partners, the CARIFORUM EPA as a whole is also the worst performer on trade and investment. So, in addition to which, we have the overarching challenge in the region, which is an unanswered question, but it's not speculation. Is this region built and prepared for the kind of 21st century trade and investment commitments which these agreements imply? My answer for many years has been no. No structural capability, no economic capability, but worst of all, no political will. The fact that the EPA and CARIFORUM is not 100% implemented after 10 years just tells us so. There is no political will. So now you throw on the challenge of the UK leaving the EU, and it's going to raise challenges for an already institutionally challenged region. Already the Dominican Republic is asking itself, well, maybe we should go with the Central Americans and negotiate with the UK separate from CARIFORUM, because we don't know what the Caribbean is going to do. Already, as David Jessup mentioned, none of us knows, well, how will the EU and the UK respond to Cuba, which for many years we've been talking should be part of a CARIFORUM negotiation. So I think, you know, these are established factual issues which very few people in the region are looking at and preparing for. So it still brings us back to Richard's point that the region needs to prepare people to assess, review, and project implementations as to what you're going to do, because this is already happening. The Brexit is just, you know, the cherry on the pie of something that's been happening for 10 years, which is very bad performance in the relationship with the EU.
Well, let me transition then to Richard, because the question to you is really one of, well, to comment on that, I mean, you alluded to it in the beginning, but is one of the questions here deeper integration within the region itself? Is that part of the weakness that the region has struggled? When I say region writ large, so of course including the DR into this space as well. But is that part of one of the elements that has to be considered while we're observing and preparing for the near term, that the region has to also focus on deeper integration, making this market a lot more accessible and a lot more competitive so that it's better prepared to deal with all of these shocks and to engage more effectively?
Thank you. Let us establish what it is we need to respond to and how quickly it's going to happen. In regard to trade, first of all, the Economic Partnership Agreement, are you hearing me? Anton, are you hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Okay, fine. I'm saying that in regard to the Economic Partnership Agreement, first we have to note that we haven't made full use of it. We haven't fully implemented it, and the European Union is not our major trading partner. However, the UK market within that remains important. The negotiations for the exit are likely to take several years, which means the Economic Partnership Agreement remains in place. Built into that agreement are various institutional arrangements to review and recalibrate the agreement. When the UK does in fact leave that agreement, I see no reason why the agreement has to be renegotiated. Britain has dropped out and will not be applying it. What has to be negotiated is the UK's relationship with CARIFORUM, but the agreement doesn't have to be renegotiated. I agree with Inda that for the moment the Commonwealth is not going to be an alternative area for us to pursue, although there are many opportunities there which have languished for many years. All of this is taking place at a time when the regional integration process has reached a difficult stage, both in terms of the politics of integration and in terms of deeper economic integration. This only points to the need to re-examine and refresh the view of economic integration. One of the areas which should receive attention is the widening of CARICOM to include the full membership of the Dominican Republic and Cuba. This would, in effect, change the critical political mass which the region could bring to bear on any external negotiations. Based on our experience in CARIFORUM, it is not going to be an easy process, but I think it's one of the areas that the integration process needs to examine. It would offer a wider pool of resources, opportunities, economies of scale. On the other hand, the region has to now take a realistic look at deeper integration and to assess its political and technical feasibility, and if there are areas which can benefit the international competitiveness and the emergence of new and diversified exports, particularly in services, then the region needs to move very quickly on this. Perhaps the Brexit is the kind of external shock which can galvanize that kind of revisiting of the vision of regional integration. But I think regional integration has a role to play in the response of the region to this change in the global economic situation.
Let me swing across to you quickly, Inda, in terms of the services area as being an area where there is a future for the region. as the region transitions from its past, and as the region looks further in terms of global more active engagement in the global economy, and maybe this being the prompt for the region to take some aggressive action as it relates to services as a competitive area.
Please unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yeah, you're back.
So, what is the task facing the Caribbean regarding the integration of services in the global context? Is that the question?
The question is services a key area where the region can be competitive, as many do think, and is this a prompt for services writ large to be for this avenue to be very, very aggressively pursued?
Okay, I'll put it in the context of what was being discussed before. So basically, there were three options laid on the table regarding trade, without specifying services versus goods. One was a very valid point that David put, that the RPA, there was an evaluation done by the European Commission on the RPA a few years ago. It was a very dismal implementation. That most businesses in the Caribbean did not know about it, had not exploited it. I mean, not only have not exploited that opportunity, but did not even know about those opportunities. So that is, we already have an agreement that's not fully exploited. I think that is the first thing to do, to promote the framework and promote businesses to start negotiating or entering into the European market. And so David is completely right. It's a very differential response to the RPA amongst different countries. Commonwealth, as I said, is a part, and I was suggesting that Latin America and the Asia. Then in terms of markets, then comes the question, what kind of trade? Is it goods or services? You have most of the OECS countries, Barbados, Bahamas, is essentially tourist countries. And ad nauseum, people talk about diversification of the economy away from tourism or financial services. And I've chatted many a time with Ambassador Bernal, who brings out always health, an assortment of different things that could be used, which could be the future. So I'm not sure that diversification away from tourism is necessarily a very viable strategy, or move into other services than tourism and financial services. What is definitely viable is to look for different source countries. Look for tourists arriving from non-traditional markets. The Caribbean Economic Team in the IDB, we did some simulations showing that if this is inevitable, if the portfolio of source countries for many of the tourist Caribbean countries was more diversified, the economic growth would be higher and volatility would be less. I mean, it's a standard ramification of a diversified portfolio. So that's one answer. I think there is going to be problems of what services beyond tourism, though. A lot of countries have depended upon, but with all this new legislation regarding tax havens, the problem of de-risking that's occurring, the problem of loss of correspondent banks, many of these institutions are being risk averse, not to be confronted by regulators in the United States. And so this area, which was a very important area since independence, may no longer be a dynamic source of growth and employment. but could actually contract. So it's a complex question you asked. Without doubt, I don't think a country, many of the countries in the OECS or Bahamas, Barbados, perhaps, could really production away from tourism towards manufacturing goods without some kind of infant industry type of subsidies to nurture them. So I think the answer more immediately is more exploit the advantage one has for the agreement with Europe and promote it and get local industry or the tourism to exploit that agreement with the European Union. And secondly, start diversifying source countries. The movements towards other services, you confront immediately the same problem, which is overvalued exchange rates. Many of our countries have fixed exchange rates. And there's a lot of reasoning behind and raison d'etre for having fixed exchange rates. But that does mean that you're more expensive. I mean, the Barbados, Bahamas are expensive places to go for tourism compared to emerging competitors. I can't recollect, I think people use the hamburger index or something like that. How much does a hamburger cost? But which gives you a very visual way of thinking about how more costly. Everybody, when I speak, say, also for the last 5 years or so, expenditure per capita by tourists have been falling in the Caribbean versus expenditure per capita in other tourist areas, particularly in the Pacific. So even in where a very important part of income is derived from tourism, even there's perhaps big signs of that something needs to be done to move up the value chain regarding not only the source countries, but what type of tourists. I know that's enthusiastic, but that's one answer. By the way, this thing of whether we should focus on strengthening the regional integration. I always quote, and I've forgotten at this particular moment the name of the author, but in 1963 or 62, a Jamaican economist studying the West Indian Federation said, this is doomed, this will break up. His arguments weren't the political administrative part of the West Indies Federation, which made a lot of sense, which was the raison d'etre by the British. But he said it makes no economic sense, given that there is no complementarity necessarily between the members of the West Indian Federation. And I have a suspicion you could still apply today to the members of CARICOM and CARIFORUM. They're very similar in what they do. They're very similar in what they produce. There's no, if you join a club, you want some strong members. There's no real large, strong member of CARICOM, perhaps Trinidad, but it's not really in that sense. So even that, I think it would be a false agenda to say let's as a major option to strengthen regional integration. I mean, the reason why this free movement of goods, economic, I'm not sure that there's a good economic raison d'etre for CARICOM, and that may be underlying the problem. I mean, people always criticize, I don't know, the institutions, the Secretary General, things like that. And I have a suspicion it has nothing to do with that. It's not that people are incompetent or anything. It's that the economic incentive. So I also would be hesitant. I would put strengthening regional integration not on the agenda, but strengthening regional entities negotiating new deals. Maybe. There's always an assumption that, and services are difficult to negotiate here. I'm not sure, but maybe somebody can clarify. Canada does not.
Thanks. Towards the end, we got just a little bit of a glitch in terms of what you were saying, but I think we come away a little more enlightened. I want to sort of round up with
May I add something to
Sure. Please, Richard, go ahead.
I know I'm breaking the speaking order, but I wanted to suggest that the expansion of our export of services does not necessarily imply diversifying away from tourism. In fact, there are synergies in certain services areas which build on the capacity, and I illustrate this by saying tourism has synergies with wellness and travel tourism, and it also has synergies with retirement communities, so that you can build on some of the infrastructure and the management capacity of an internationally competitive sector, which is tourism, to expand and diversify not only from tourism, but from the base of tourism to other areas. And I close simply by saying that there are tremendous opportunities in services, and I illustrate by one. I now feel that the next growth sector for the Caribbean could be a cluster of higher education institutions. And I base that not because I'm at the University of the West Indies, but on the fact that private institutions have done well in St. Kitts and Grenada. And I see no reason why already established higher education institutions couldn't form a cluster. It's a clean industry, it's a high labor industry, high value added, no economies of scale, etc. And I believe that this is the next important sector, and that is why I have chosen to be at the University of the West Indies.
Thanks, Richard. I wanna ask two questions quickly, and I want David Lewis and Marla's interaction on this. And one is time back into the issue of services. David, you've done a fair amount of work and been a strong advocate in terms of services in the region. And in as much as a lot of it has been focused on the U.S. Side of things, I mean, do you see this as you know, a further prompt for the region to engage in the services space and try to look at that as a trade space? Maybe ask you to focus on the U.S. efforts, and then Marla, the question for you is, beyond tourism, what do you see? Because we've spent a little bit of time here on tourism. Richard just talked about education. Talk about the revenue side of this thing in terms of really employment, in terms of generating foreign exchange. I'd appreciate your comments in terms of what has been laid out. So let me turn to you, David, first, and then we turn to Marla, and then we'll have a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure, thank you, Anton. No, I agree with Richard. I mean, if we look at the region, even the Dominican Republic and Trinidad, which are manufacturing economies, are already 63% plus services in their GDP, for those of us who look at those figures of any value. When you go into the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean, and especially the Eastern Caribbean, you're looking at 85–90% plus already in services. Most of that, almost half of it, if not more, in tourism. So if you're looking at this from a business model perspective, which is how American companies look at the region, what you want to do is leverage on a successful industry, which is tourism, and build on the service qualities, the education, the infrastructure, and so on, into other growth areas, whether they be education, whether it be medical, we have it in the ICT sector, and so on, cultural industries, and so on. The big challenge remains, as was mentioned by Inder, in a region of small economy of scale, you need capital. You need investment to make this happen, and the major challenge for many of the entrepreneurial elements in the region and outside looking to build that B2B linkage is, where is the capital going to come from to move this forward? And in that sense, the region is also at a disadvantage, because even with the single market and economy and so on, we do not have a seamless capital investment regime across the region to facilitate this kind of effort. So one of the challenges you're now seeing when you have services companies in the US that we've been working with looking at opportunities in the Caribbean is that it's one set of rules and regulations for the courier industry in Jamaica, it's another set for Trinidad and Tobago, it's another one if you go into St. Lucia, and just multiply that by every service sector. We do not have a harmonized economic integration body in CARICOM that is attractive to foreign investment. That remains a problem. So we still have the sum of the parts is not equaling a whole, it is still equaling 14 or 13 or whatever, and you can do very well on that. The Jamaica tourism industry is doing very well on that. The Barbados tourism industry up to a few years ago, cost problems now, does very well on that. But the challenge is, if you're really going to grow it, you need that harmonized economic system across markets. We have a challenge, which is we don't have geographic continuity like, say, Central America has. But the fact that our rules and regulations still do not incentivize this is probably the #1 major problem to growth in this area.
Thanks, David. Marla, I'll turn to you.
Hi, thanks, Anton. To your question, what do we have beyond tourism? The thing about it is, if you look at the way all of our economies are structured, Inderjeet did a lovely paper that outlined how that in this region we have low fiscal multipliers, which means fiscal spending, 80% of it, sometimes 90% of it, leaks out in the form of imports, right? So we cannot rely on government spending to generate growth in this region. We need private sector-led activity. And to David's previous point that he just made, we don't have the capital, especially with nervous banks. As Inderjeet outlined, we have banks de-risking, and loss of correspondent banking is a growing problem in the region. So we have to fix that problem of how do we get the investment in to allow us to, if you look at the equation for GDP, consumption plus government spending plus investment minus imports plus exports, we need to promote exports and we need to promote investments. Those are the only two factors that really drive GDP and by extension will drive employment. Now, with respect to investment, if you can't get it through government spending, because most of the governments are heavily indebted, that's where people like the Inderjeet, the IDB, the CDB, the development banks, and the multilateral and bilateral partners come in. Now, the other area I think that is really an opportunity that we need to harness and we need to grasp in this region is renewable energy. The fact that oil and gas prices are low now, it's a bit of a disincentive to invest in that industry. But I think that if you have a reliance on renewables more so than fossil fuels in most islands in the Caribbean, I think that will unlock a lot of resources that can be spent on other areas. I know that there is something that ECLAC is working on with respect to getting some debt forgiveness in exchange for a switch to renewable energy. I hope that takes off, but I really do think that beyond tourism, we need to be thinking about renewables. We need to be thinking more about a private sector-led growth strategy as opposed to this continuous reliance on fiscal spending. Thanks.
Which allows me to transition to a follow-up to you, but one to David. One of the questions here was, one of the questions asked was really the sustainability of the pound sterling and some questions in terms of valuations there. So I want to ask you to weigh in on that. And then another question coming in, which I'll open up to whoever wants to respond, is a point that was made, which is that businesses trade, not governments. And the sense is that we've been talking about this in terms of governments leading trade negotiations. So the question, the other part of the question is the private sector. I mean, what does the private sector do, or can the private sector do anything? Who are some of the movers and shakers that we see being able to maybe react best to this, short, medium, and long term. So to you, David, the first question is about valuations of the pound sterling and any such impact.
Well, if I had a crystal ball, I don't think I'd be sitting here if I could tell you the valuation. But one of the things that has interested me over the last few days has been the suggestion from some financial analysts that it may settle at around 125 to the dollar, something like that. We're in this area of total unpredictability. I mean, the governor of the Bank of England has suggested the possibility of a recession. I take note of some of the things that Marla was saying a little bit earlier on. So that's my best guess, but it is a guess. And as far as the private sector is concerned, one of the things that I think is actually really important, and in my view, and perhaps Richard Bernal would also comment on this, is the engagement of the private sector in any future trade negotiation with the United Kingdom, if indeed there is a trade negotiation, is absolutely critical, because the sense I had during the EPA negotiations is that some parts of the Caribbean private sector simply weren't joined up with government, and that while whatever happens in terms of a new relationship with the United Kingdom has to be led by governments, it seems that right from the word go, from now, private sector interests need to be making clear where they think they may or may not suffer, what kind of access they need, etc. And the point that David Lewis was also making, I think, earlier on is it needs to be seen in the context of opportunity as well. I mean, new opportunity. I mean, where there may be something better, for instance, to be negotiated with the United Kingdom, or some kind of carve out. I mean, one of the areas that is fascinating, yes, as Richard Bernal was saying, is I mean, theoretically, the EPA can just stay in place and be adopted by the United Kingdom. But is that actually what the Caribbean wants? Is it not, like Inda was saying, that, or Marla was saying, is that new relationships should be looked at? And in a peculiar way, this is an opportunity. Once one's got past the sort of fright stage, whether it's about the value of sterling and the effect on tourism, or what may or may not happen next.
Thanks, David. I'd like to invite anybody else who wants to comment very briefly on the businesses trade element versus governments and the private sector's role as it relates to going forward.
Can I jump in?
I'll take up your challenge, Anton, which is based on the experience of our WTO negotiations, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and the EPA negotiations. The private sector, we had to really make an effort to engage them. We created a special department for the private sector to inform them in non-technical briefs. We ran boot camps, seminars, and yet we did not get the kind of response which was ideal. We even had a special business executive appointed for the duration of the EPA as a voice for the private sector, and we took that person with us to all the negotiations. The problems are the following. One, exports tend to be concentrated in a few large firms and a few large sectors. Those large firms participated. Bananas, sugar, rum, and the larger firms who could afford to deploy someone to follow the negotiations, they participated. But for the majority of firms, they were small, they didn't have the time or the capacity to follow in detail the negotiations. A second problem was that what the private sector was saying had to be filtered by government representatives. And I remember one disjuncture where the government was putting forward a very defensive position for their private sector, when the private sector was saying the problems they need cleared was not market access, but was customs, red tape, and taxes. So we have to make a much better effort to integrate the private sector, but the private sector on their side also need to pay attention to these things. I can recall well a negotiation, which I didn't do, but before me, that closed, and it's after the negotiations closed that a major sector came and said, we're going to be seriously hurt had to be reopened. So the private sector has to do a better job of ensuring that their efforts are heard. Even when the negotiators are willing to hear these, we don't get the kind of response that we should. So a better effort has to be made at integrating the private sector, and it starts with the private sector taking the initiative to articulate their views and to articulate them early and on a continuous basis.
In the let's turn to you. Thank you, Richard. In the let's turn to you for your comments on the private sector.
I think you're completely right. This it's not government that export, it's firms that export. But you can extend that. It's not governments that show it, but firms that employ. The health of the Caribbean going forward is measured by the health of the private sector. And if you compare, we've been doing research into this area because very little is known about the private sector in the Caribbean. It doesn't have economic census, it doesn't typically have surveys, etc., which we did do a number of times now. And you find something which is a little bit disconcerting. And I say that because we talked about large firms, large traditional firms. What we find, if you compare the Caribbean firms with firms in other small economies around the world, so you exclude the problem of small economies, and you say, how is Caribbean doing with respect to other small economies who are also subject to the same problem? What you find is a very, very disconcerting characterization of the Caribbean private sector. It's smaller. The typical firm is much smaller, but it's simultaneously much older. It's a firm that typically does not engage in international trade at much lower rates than those in the other small economies around the world. It spends more on security than it does on research and development. And even if it innovates, its returns are much lower. And so if you look at it in terms of characteristics, the private sector it has all the characteristics which are associated with poor performance. We looked at the total factor productivity of firms and compared it to the ones in other small economies. Much, much lower total factor productivity, much, much lower level of innovation. But the answer is not the private sector is not doing its job. The next question is, why is it like that? And here is that governments in the Caribbean are not pro-business, other small economies. The problem here is an institutionalized rent-seeking, where large firms set the laws, the regulations, etc., at the expense of the rest of the small economy. So I think the policy framework in the Caribbean is good for some business men, but it's not good for business. The only thing the Caribbean does well, and I'm sure that people listening here, is around the world, women-owned firms do poorly relative to male-owned firms. The Caribbean is the only place where women-owned firms or managed by women do better than their male-owned. All right, Marla. That's about the only positive thing of this study we found. But they also manage small firms because either due to self-selection or due to difficulties of access of financing. So I think this phrase that it's not countries that export, but firms that export, and how firms should be involved in not only market access, but at home, governments need to make a major effort at what Ambassador Bernal was mentioning, the problem of red tape, problem of getting export or import permits, the problem of having lack of single windows for exporting or international trade. You know, all the business environment interface between the government and the private sector needs to be one which is much more favorable to the private sector, and therefore allow the private sector to develop. And then I'm not talking about the small firms. I'm not talking about the large traditional firms in the Caribbean. I'm talking about all the rest. If the government's made a major effort in creating a pro-business environment and complementing it by supporting private firms in their search for export markets, not
I think we've
Anton.
Yes. And
Hi. You know, I'm an official in the UK government in London. I deal with international trade and investment. I'm a permanent, you know, civil servant, so I'm not moving, no matter who comes in. And, you know, already the central bank president of Honduras has contacted me to discuss how Honduras should deal with the UK leaving the EU. Already a variety of people in the Dominican Republic have contacted me on this. And I could go on and on and on. And I'm sure David Jessup has a lot of stories on this. I have still yet to hear from anybody in the Caribbean. And I think that is the issue facing here. The Caribbean supposedly has the best among equals of all trade and investment relationships with the EU and therefore with the UK, in which the UK is the dominant partner for the Caribbean, and there is no proactive effort coming from the Caribbean to this official in London. And he and his team are going to have to deal with 500 requests from over 100 trade partners. Where do you think they're going to place the priority of the Caribbean when faced with that, when they do not even get a phone call, an email, or a visit from the ambassador in London of those countries? That's really the issue we're talking about here.
fair enough, David. Good point and well made. A question to Sally and Melissa. Do we have time for one more question, or do we have a hard stop?
Yeah, we can take one more, Anton, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
So this is the loaded question here, which came in, which is, you know, is what's happening, is the Brexit sort of a one step away or one prompt for a carry exit or a carry exit? The talk within the region about you know, the people departing from CARICOM and the failure of the integration efforts. So the loaded question, and I'm going to ask everybody to comment on this, is that does this provide the political cover or economic cover for us to see a collapse of the Caribbean's effort at integration? Marla, you'll go first.
I just wanted to say that, I mean, other people have spoken about this, that the integration effort in the Caribbean has really stalled on many levels. So I don't know that this has any bearing on what has happened in the UK. And furthermore, let's not forget that the main driver of this Brexit referendum result was really the immigration and refugee issue, which, you know, I think we have to be careful of how we draw parallels to the CARICOM region with respect to the UK. Thank you.
Very diplomatic. David Jessup, what about you? Why don't you weigh in and give us your thoughts?
Okay, I agree with Marla, firstly, that there is no parallel to the actual circumstance. That said, I was particularly struck by the excessive number of comments I saw immediately after the vote in the Caribbean on various sort of social media, sort of saying, is there now this the same for us? It should not have the same effect, but I fear it may. Quick answer.
Fair enough. Richard?
Yes. The referendum in the UK certainly could influence other countries in the EU who are disgruntled to pose to their electorates whether they want to remain or go, or if they want to try and change the terms of their engagement. In the Caribbean, the Prime Minister of Jamaica has set up a commission chaired by former Prime Minister Bruce Golding. He has made it clear that the terms of reference of that commission do not include the question of Jamaica leaving CARICOM. It is about issues which Jamaica feels need to be addressed, and these could range from treatment of Jamaicans traveling in the region, a wide range of issues. So the Commission is not examining whether Jamaica should stay or leave CARICOM. Jamaica intends to stay in CARICOM. The Commission is about addressing certain difficulties that have been experienced. Let me add one thing while I have the floor, which is one of the big concerns in Jamaica has been the trade deficit between Trinidad and Jamaica. Let us be clear that this has nothing to do with Trinidad or Jamaica. If Jamaica was to cease importing from Trinidad, they do not yet have the domestic capacity to produce at competitive rates. Those Jamaica would then start to import from elsewhere. So the question of the trade deficit is not about any unfair trade practices or about any advantages Trinidad might have. It has to do with the international competitiveness of Jamaica's production in the manufacturing sector. So Jamaica is not, the Commission is not examining leave or stay. It is examining issues which Jamaica feels needs to be addressed to ensure that CARICOM can continue to function and to progress.
Well, pretty much a definitive statement, but I still got to turn to you, David Lewis, in terms of any comments you have, any thoughts you have in terms of the region splitting apart or sort of not working as closely as it could be in terms of integration.
Thank you, Anton. I think the key point here is that what Brexit is doing is just bringing to the surface many of these similar challenges of integration in CARICOM. And the fact is that it's still a 1970s import substitution, industrialization, closed trade and investment regime. And we're in the 21st century of open trade regimes with full single market and economies for the free movement of labor, capital, goods and services. And CARICOM needs to revise itself for that. Hopefully the Commission work in Jamaica will be a step in that direction, but at the end of the day it's going to be an issue of political will. And if not, you know, maybe the answer is maybe there is a room in the global economy for a small region of 11 million people to have a closed economic integration regime because it cannot handle open trade and investment regimes. That's something that nobody has really looked at, but maybe that is the way for a small group to go.
Thanks, David. We're going to turn to Inda for the last comments, and then I'll transition across to Sally to close us out.
I must confess I didn't understand why it's a loaded question.
Well.
But so unfortunately, I don't have the eloquence that Mala has in answering you. So let me try. Listen, the West Indies Federation fell apart because of withdrawal of Jamaica and Trinidad, if I recollect rightly. I don't know which one was the one that first withdrew from it. So the other day, you know, in headlines, sometimes capture realities that are going on. So I asked one of my research fellows to look at the frequency of complaints by Trinis against Jamaicans and Jamaicans against Trinis. You know, including things like a member of parliament in Trinidad suggesting that the special areas should be created at the airport for Jamaicans entering into the country. This flare-up, do a word search in the news, etc., for the last few decades, where you can get data, and ask whether the frequency was increasing and was there an upward drift. The frequency, yes, is increasing, and there was an upward drift. That's the mission that's been created in Jamaica, the question of membership of CARICOM. Action that CARICOM has not yet delivered on the promise of free movement of goods and labor. So, that being necessary question, I think these are questions that should be subject to empirical evidence. CARICOM working? Why is it not working? How would it be better if it could work? Or should it, as an agenda, no longer be the effort of its members? I mean, it shouldn't be a political issue. Let me put it the other way. It should be a political issue which is evidence-based regarding the pros and cons, independently of the frequency of Jamaicans and Tunis complaining about each other.
Thank you for that. Let's transition across to Sally. Thank you very, very much in terms of the speakers and as it relates to the interactions. I think we all leave here a little more aware as to what the prognosis is and a lot more, I think, enthused in terms of recognizing that it's not all gloom and doom. Sally, let me turn to you.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to everybody who has stayed with us. We've gone over time, but it's been a great discussion. I know there's a lot of questions that are coming out of this, and so we look forward to continuing the discussion. From Caribbean Central American Action, I do want to thank Melissa, Anton, David Jessup, Marla, Richard, David Lewis, and of course Inder, who's here with me. Thank the partners at OWIT and at the Caribbean Council who joined with us in promoting this event. I also want to mention, you know, in terms of this discussion continuing, there will be a hearing on the Hill tomorrow where both Richard and I are scheduled to speak, talking about strategic engagement with the region. So I think there are a lot of things going on right now that are all coming together. And it could be an interesting time for the Caribbean. So I look forward to working with all of you, and to all the audience, thanks again for joining.
Thank you.